Welcome to On the Middle East, Al Monitor's weekly podcast on the big events and trends shaping the region. My name is Ambryn Zaman, and I'll be looking at rising violence against women in Turkey. Almost daily, there are stories of women being stalked, attacked, and killed by men, more often than not by their husbands. Around 4 out of 10 women in Turkey say they were subjected to physical and/or sexual violence, according to the Turkish government's own research, but that dates from 2014, and it's not produced any further figures. The government's decision to withdraw from the Istanbul Convention on Preventing Violence Against Women, a document that it spearheaded in 2011, has added to the culture of impunity, women's rights groups say. Turkey, a majority Muslim country, was among the first countries in the world to give women the right to vote. The ruling Justice and Development Party introduced further reforms in the early days of its rule, some of it groundbreaking, such as criminalizing marital rape and stating that women are equal to men in the family. So what's changed and why? With us here to discuss these matters is Emma Sinclair-Webb, Turkey Director for Human Rights Watch and the author of an exhaustive new report on domestic violence against women. Welcome to the program, Emma. It's really great to have you today on our show.
Thank you.
So you've just done this amazing report on violence against women, and I just want to start off by asking you about the government's withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention and what that actually means, what sort of message it carries, and what the implications are for women in their everyday lives. The government says that it's enacted sweeping legislation to deter and penalize violence against women. Therefore, there is no need for this convention. And even as women's groups challenge the move in court, the government is seeking to ban a women's platform against femicides. Why has the government turned against the convention, and does its defense hold any water?
Well, the Turkish government, actually the Turkish president, President Erdogan, issued a decree a year ago pulling Turkey out of the Istanbul Convention. And the convention is a Council of Europe convention, which is really the gold standard for protecting women from violence, combating domestic violence. And it's a convention that, Turkey was the first country to sign up to. It's the first country to withdraw from it. So that's pretty extraordinary. Turkey's argument really is that it has its own legislation in place. And we do know that its legislation in place is largely based on the Istanbul Convention, and that this legislation is somehow enough to tackle gender-based violence, violence against women, domestic violence in all its forms. And that, is the Turkish government's argument. Also, the Turkish government says, we have a very sophisticated legal framework for combating violence against women. So we don't need an international convention, a foreign convention, to somehow guide us in this endeavor. It's a very worrying argument because it basically gives the message somehow that fighting domestic violence, violence against women isn't a kind of political priority. Withdrawing from such an important convention definitely has sent this political message that to ordinary people and to around the country that somehow deprioritizes the struggle against violence against women. However, going in the opposite direction, Turkey's undoubtedly made lots of attempts to prove that it really is very committed to protecting women from violence. And that's a rather paradoxical situation. On the one hand, you pull out a convention. On the other hand, you make your domestic efforts to sort of shore up the protection of women. Yes, and at the same time, as you mentioned, we see another undermining sign in which, a very successful campaigning platform called the We Will Protect, We Will End Femicides platform is faced with a closure case. It's an association that was set up really to campaign on murders of women by partners, spouses, men unknown to them, victims of sexual violence who were killed. It looks at all of those murders and it compiles its own data on those murders.
I mean, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but one very important point that your paper makes is the fact that the Istanbul Convention allows for independent monitoring of all of this, and now that's gone, right?
Yes, no, absolutely. So with the withdrawal from the convention, you have the group of experts that were tasked with sort of reviewing Turkey's record every few years are now not able to do that anymore, because a lot of conventions have with them monitoring committees or bodies that examine a country's compliance with what's in the convention. So that's gone too, unfortunately.
Yeah. And so, I mean, on the one hand, they claim we have all these laws, and they do. But on the other hand, they seem to be just, inch by inch, or, I mean, depending on your viewpoint, you may say kilometer by kilometer, hacking away at all the defenses that women have against this violence. And the political messaging is also, I think, quite scary. And as your excellent report makes very clear, none of these existing laws are actually being implemented. Can you just cite several of these cases, that you mentioned in your report? Tell us a bit about, what's happening to these women actually, and how in some cases there has been some redress, but in others absolutely none, and probably, more often none than some, right?
Yes, well, I mean, the cases themselves are, extremely worthy of mention, because it brings to the whole subject home, really. A lot of the time when we research reports like this, we, of course, have to look at government data. We have to, interview a lot of different authorities, and we have indeed talked a lot to the police, to judges, to prosecutors. And that was enormously helpful in seeing their view of the challenges they face. And then we assessed 18 cases in great detail, really great detail. We looked at the case histories of how women who had a history of domestic violence had gone to the authorities to complain. And usually they go to the police, first of all. Most women start by going to the police if they need protection against a partner, a spouse, or an ex-partner. And then they get from court something called a protection order. And in Turkish law, there are different kinds of protection orders, but some of these are restraining orders called preventive orders, and it actually tells the man to keep away from the woman. So the victim, gets this, secures this from a court, and the man is not supposed to approach her, or the perpetrator of violence is not supposed to approach her. What we see is that in the cases we've examined is that women have time and time again applied for protection, got preventive orders, restraining orders, but in fact, the violence continues because somehow these court orders are not implemented. And we have, perhaps one of the most dramatic cases, very well known to the Turkish public, is the case of Ayşe Tuba Arslan in Eskişehir, a town in Western Turkey, who is on record as having complained 23 times to the police and prosecutors for protection from her abusive former husband. She divorced her husband in the course of the violence and while seeking protection. And a few months later, he killed her. A knife attack with a meat cleaver, extremely violent. She died of her injuries later in hospital. Now, in this case, it's the prosecutor's office who said, yes, she complained 23 times. Now, that's an incredible indictment of Turkey's, police, courts, prosecutors, that how could a woman complain that much and still end up dead? Despite the fact she was known, very well known to the authorities. There were cases against her husband ongoing at the time of her murder. She'd received protective orders, restraining orders. They had not been implemented. So that's one case, a very well-known case. Then there are other cases where women have gone and complained. One woman's husband, Remziye Yoldaş, her husband was released from prison. He came and threatened her, and he escaped from prison. He was in an open prison, in fact, which allows a man to regularly get out of prison, in fact. He came and threatened her, and she sought police protection. She got a restraining order. He came and killed her in the street. So in that case, very interestingly, we heard from the police themselves via the Interior Ministry that 9 police officers did receive some kind of disciplinary penalty for failing to protect Remziye Yoldaş, killed in Diyarbakir.
Well, women are among the best organized groups in Turkish civil society. I mean, I don't know if you'd agree. I think you would agree. And
absolutely.
Yeah, and they include pious, Islamic women who have been very active in sort of women's groups. And of course, principally, we first heard of them when they were working to ease the bans on the Islamic headscarf. And we had an exemplary show of solidarity in the early days of Erdogan's rule, where, so-called secular women were supporting them, right? And these women have been very active in the grassroots level, helping Erdogan during his elections. And, they must be feeling very, very let down as well, I would imagine. I mean, what is the culture that informs this misogyny? I think it would be, wrong to sort of fall into the stereotype of, oh, this is Islamic. It's because the government is Islamic.
Absolutely. I think, when looking at violence against women, domestic violence in any society, you have to see there are so many different root causes and so many aspects to a culture of misogyny. It's not all in the hands of the government, the state at all. It's a social problem all over the world still. So I think what we do see is a wave of right populism through many countries in which women's bodies and women are up for grabs as they become weaponized in political debates, whether from Hungary to Poland or Turkey. The focus on women, on their status, on issues like gender equality, gender ideology, is very much played out in relation to the rights of women and undermining the visibility of women in society. So I think it's not at all particular to Turkey. The trouble with withdrawing from the convention was that Turkey assumes, I think, the government assumes that you can kind of dispense with ideas of gender equality. And indeed, the president is on record as sort of basically refuting the notion of gender equality in favor of saying that men and women are different and that women need to be protected. Now, this is a conservative, paternalistic view of women. And yes, that could be a protective view of women, but it's a view that legitimizes discrimination. And once you see women as inferior, as not equal with men, then I think you have a big problem to argue against violence against women, because once you're allowing for discrimination against women, then you open the way to violence. And I think that's one of the ways in which the government has contributed to a culture of violence, which, as I say, is not entirely coming from the state, from the government. It's a social phenomenon, very complex issue in every society.
I mean, for sure, I agree. Especially, the sort of messaging from Erdogan. And before I get to that, though, I think it's worth reminding our audience that one of the reasons the government cited for getting out of the convention was the fact that it claimed it somehow encouraged so-called deviant behavior, homosexuality, gay rights, that sort of thing that clashes with Turkey's traditions, culture, right? And that's something that you see also, as you pointed out, in these populist sort of autocratic governments in places like Poland and Hungary as well. It's kind of a culture war, right?
It is. It absolutely is. And, it's weaponizing. It's attempting to weaponize homophobia to sort of produce a very divisive them and us view of a society. Those who, are on the side of LGBT rights, those of us who are pious conservatives, it pits different parts of society against each other. And that's, again, it's played out, as we said before, or over women's bodies, but it's also played out over LGBT rights as well. And the idea of homosexuality as somehow dangerous to Turkish society, dangerous to the family. That's the argument that's made. The
hypocrisy, though, is mind-boggling, because you see Erdogan, posing with Bülent Ersoy, Turkey's best-known sort of, I guess, would we call him her trans figure, famous singer. And I was just watching Turkish TV today, and it was a cooking program. So you had a guy who was obviously, I would say, gay. I hope I'm not being politically incorrect, very effeminate, etc., with his body language and all, who was teaching these women how to cook. And, half of them had, I would say more than half, were wearing headscarves, and it all seemed perfectly fine and normal. So it's sort of, kind of out of touch with the reality on the ground, where there is much more, I hate the word tolerance, but, acceptance, I guess, anyway. But
I think that's right. I think that's absolutely right. And, for years, Pride's been banned. But, people didn't have a problem with Pride. It was growing in popularity and visibility in Turkey. So having bans on, LGBT rights, sort of Pride and other kind of events is just, it's ludicrous. It's a government hypocrisy for sure.
Yeah, but getting back to Erdogan and his messaging, well, the big news for much of the week was the fact that he was referring to demonstrators who took part in the mass Gezi protests back in 2013 as sluts. I mean, so often he sort of uses that kind of language. In fact, I was subjected to it myself, as you recall. He called me names in public. What did he call me? Indecent woman, and that sort of thing. so that also is very troubling, isn't it? That it's coming at the highest level.
It's absolutely troubling. I mean, it's a kind of hate speech, isn't it? It's demonizing a part of the population. We've got a lot of discourse going on, very xenophobic discourse against refugees going on in Turkey. We all know that too. But terming the Gezi supporters sluts, again, it's this question of trying to produce very divisive politics based on fomenting divisiveness, dividing people, dividing the society. You choose between them and us, them the immoral ones, us the good ones. It's a very crude tactic, but it's highly offensive, and I don't think it plays well actually in Turkish society anymore. People have better things to worry about. They're worried about the economy. They're worried about whether they'll be putting food on the table. I think hearing part of the population referred to as sluts isn't really what you'd expect from a statesman.
Though, Emma, it gets picked up at least by the men, because I in my own case, after Erdogan said that, then his bodyguard, one of his security details, called me a whore in Washington, and it was sort of quite unsettling. And then on social media, that when people were attacking me, they kept calling me that. So, he sort of, as I said, legitimizes it. On the one hand, as you say, people have far greater problems. But then on the other, these problems also probably sort of amplify the violence in a sense, because, when people are having problems, they can't pay the bills, they can't afford to put bread on the table. I think that also breeds violence, doesn't it? And so if you as the president are sort of targeting women, makes the problem worse.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think, there's a very toxic culture on Twitter around this, and extremely abusive. But we see this, in many places in the world, of course, this extremely awful kind of a backlash against Me Too is going on in the United States. We see that just with the result on the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial. So it's not particular to Turkey, this attack on women. I think there is a toxic culture against women in many places.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And they do seem, people like, Erdogan do seem very threatened by women, the way he sort of goes after, like Canan Kaftancıoğlu, the head of the Istanbul branch of the main opposition party, for example. But I mean,
and Meral Akşener of the other, another opposition party, the E Party. Indeed.
Absolutely. And so I would like to end by asking you, Emma, who have been, doing this amazing work for all these years in Turkey, and having to talk to lots of men, prosecutors, police chiefs, ministers, local bureaucrats. I mean, have you found it difficult as a woman dealing with them? Has that been like a problem for you? Made you more vulnerable?
No, I think the thing is, as time goes on, you get very used to this, of course, very male culture of the bureaucracy of ministries. I have had many meetings with government officials over time. I go in as a researcher, and I suppose you become somehow insensitized to the fact that you are a woman researcher doing this work. In a way, it makes you rather steely, I would say, when faced with so many men. That has been my experience. But I go into such meetings, of course, I'm British, I'm a white middle-class woman. I have, privilege on my side of another kind. Now, many women don't have that. And so I think it depends on where you are from and who you are, depending on how you handle these sort of situations and how you are seen. But of course, I've chosen to disregard a lot of the very sexist kind of approach that often does prevail. I mean,
well, look, you've been doing great work, and this report is really good and very important. And thank you so very much for taking the time to speak to us today, Emma. Keep up the brilliant work, and hope to have you on our program again soon.
Thank you very much, Amber, and it's been a real pleasure. And maybe I can say one more thing, is that, everyone needs to continue working on this endemic problem of domestic violence against women. It's a long struggle. It's not only about Turkey withdrawing from the Istanbul Convention. Turkey has a lot to do to enforce its own laws. We do see that there are efforts by some police and judges, and there are, people who are really trying to do a good job, but they've been very undermined in their efforts by the government policy that's led to the withdrawal from the convention.
Yeah, no, it doesn't get nearly enough attention, I feel, because, people are much more focused on other stuff like, NATO and Ukraine and all of those issues, when, this is so important, affects half of the population. So yeah, that we have to keep looking, keep our eyes trained on it and keep reporting on it. Thank you again, Emma.
Thank you very much.
I'm Elizabeth Hagedorn, and I'm the State Department correspondent at Al Monitor.
And I'm Joe Snell. I'm Al Monitor's video editor. Let's admit it, this past year has been difficult to stay on top of the news and sift through what's accurate and what's misleading. Let Al Monitor help you.
If you care about the Middle East and North Africa, you should consider listening to Al Monitor's audio series On the Middle East with Andrew Parasalidi and Amber Zaman, and On Israel with Ben Caspi. You can now watch our newest video podcast, Reading the Middle East with Gilles Capel. You can subscribe to these series on your favorite podcast platforms.
And through a host of free daily and weekly newsletters, we offer a range of perspectives with the highest journalistic standards. You can subscribe to these newsletters at almonitor.com.
As an award-winning media service headquartered in Washington, D.C., Al-Monitor has a network of over 160 contributors around the world.
So if you haven't done so already, be sure to visit almonitor.com, where you can find all of these newsletters and podcasts, along with first-class reporting and analysis.
And this brings us to the end of what I hope was yet another interesting conversation about an issue that should deeply concern us all. Don't forget to take a look at Emma's report, which is linked on our website. Thank you and goodbye.